They'll tell you it's about borders. They'll say it's about defense, about survival, about protecting a nation under threat. But what if the real threat is the truth? What if behind all the walls, the weapons, and the carefully crafted headlines lies a fear no one dares to admit? This isn't just another political breakdown. This is a moral collapse, a reckoning. Because for the first time, the world is seeing what was meant to stay hidden. In this speech, we uncover the secret fear that haunts Israel from the inside out. The fear of truth, resistance, and justice rising. We go beyond the surface, behind the politics, deep into the psychology of a state built on survival but shaken by exposure. If you think you know the story, wait. By the end of this video, you'll see what they never wanted you to understand. Not just what's happening in Gaza or the West Bank, but what's crumbling in Tel Aviv, in policy rooms, and behind closed doors. Stay with us. This isn't just a speech, it's a mirror. And once you look into it, you'll never unsee what's been hiding in plain sight. The psychological warfare Israel has long used against its perceived enemies has also created an unintended consequence. A deep-rooted fear of moral consequence that lingers beneath its displays of strength. While its defense forces are equipped with cutting-edge technology and its political machinery moves with strategic precision, there is a growing anxiety within the Israeli establishment and society at large. Not of rockets or resistance, but of what the mirror of global perception reflects back at them. The fear is not rooted in weakness of arms, but in the erosion of a moral high ground that once justified decades of occupation and security rhetoric. That fear grows louder as international audiences, once unquestioning, begin to scrutinize, challenge, and reject the historical narrative Israel has clung to. Once seen solely as a beacon of survival in a hostile region, Israel now finds itself accused of perpetuating cycles of oppression that echo the very injustices it once vowed never to allow again. This cognitive dissonance generates unease. The idea that their existence, once seen as redemptive, might now be perceived as repressive. That inner conflict is further fueled by the rising influence of digital media, independent journalism, and real-time civilian documentation. These tools, often wielded by Palestinians themselves, strip away layers of military censorship and carefully manage propaganda. The more the world sees, the less it accepts the conventional justification of its self-defense, when the destruction of civilian infrastructure and the suffering of children dominate the global feed. This exposure becomes a battlefield of its own, a psychological arena where truth and moral clarity are weapons more powerful than drones or tanks. Within this context, Israeli society wrestles not only with the consequences of international isolation or potential war crimes investigations, but with the collective weight of conscience. Many within its own population, especially among younger and secular Jews, are beginning to question the ethical cost of national security. Some are disillusioned by the perpetual state of militarization, others disturbed by the normalization of apartheid-like systems of control. This emerging introspection is not merely political, it's existential. What happens when a nation built on survival begins to sense that its actions may be morally indefensible? The psychological toll of defending not just territory but a crumbling narrative becomes a fear. No weapon can repel, and no wall can contain. The rise of unbreakable resistance among Palestinians poses a unique and profound fear for Israel, one that cannot be neutralized through conventional warfare. Unlike military threats that can be confronted with force, this resistance is rooted in identity, history, and a refusal to surrender dignity. It is psychological, generational, and deeply spiritual. Despite decades of displacement, siege, and occupation, Palestinians, especially the youth, have evolved into a symbol of resilience that defies the logic of fear and submission. Every child who returns to the rubble of their home, every mother who walks through checkpoints with her head held high, every young man or woman who speaks their truth to the world despite surveillance and intimidation, becomes part of a resistance that Israel cannot crush with missiles or arrests. This resilience terrifies Israeli leadership because it challenges the foundational belief that with enough force, any population can be broken. Unlike armed uprisings of the past, today's resistance is multidimensional. It includes art, education, journalism, digital activism, and global alliances. Palestinian youth are increasingly fluent in the language of global justice and human rights, using their voices and platforms to expose realities once hidden behind media bias. Every viral video, every witness testimony, every voice from Gaza or the West Bank that reaches a Western audience represents a strike against Israel's carefully maintained global image. This unarmed resistance undermines the narrative that Palestinians are only victims or aggressors. Instead, it presents them as defiant, conscious, and unwilling to disappear. Israel's fear lies in the realization that this resistance cannot be wiped out with operations or silenced through censorship. It is passed down through generations like a sacred inheritance. Each attempt to crush it only deepens its roots. This resistance also inspires solidarity beyond borders. From university campuses in the West to human rights organizations across continents, more people are beginning to see the Palestinian struggle as part of a global movement against colonialism, racism, and injustice. This global awakening intensifies Israel's anxiety as it faces the growing isolation of international condemnation paired with the unyielding determination of a people who refuse to forget their homeland. The fear is no longer of rockets from Gaza, but of a new generation of Palestinians rising from the ashes, not broken, but unbreakable and watched by the entire world. The global narrative surrounding Israel and Palestine is undergoing a radical transformation, and this shift is one of Israel's most deeply rooted fears. For decades, Israel carefully curated its international image through powerful lobbying, strategic diplomacy, and mainstream media narratives that often portrayed it as the eternal victim surrounded by hostile neighbors. This portrayal not only justified its policies of security and occupation, but also garnered unwavering support from Western powers. However, in recent years, the information landscape has changed dramatically. The rise of social media platforms, independent journalism, and first-hand video evidence from civilians on the ground has exposed realities that were once hidden or ignored. Images of bombed schools, detained children, and grieving families in Gaza now reach millions within seconds, often without any filters or manipulation. This raw exposure disrupts the old narrative and introduces a truth that is harder to control, harder to deny. Israel fears this exposure not just because it damages its reputation, but because it reveals contradictions that even its allies struggle to justify. When young activists, academics, and journalists begin to question long-held assumptions, when public opinion in Western countries starts to shift away from blind support and toward demands for accountability, the carefully crafted image of moral superiority begins to crack. The fear is compounded by the realization that this shift is generational and ideological. Young people around the world are growing up seeing Palestinians as human beings fighting for dignity rather than as threats or obstacles. These new global audiences are less influenced by Cold War-era narratives and more moved by the language of human rights, justice, and decolonization. This changing perception threatens Israel's ability to operate in the shadows of political immunity. International investigations, sanctions discussions, and debates about apartheid are no longer fringe topics. They are entering mainstream discourse. Israel's fear lies in the irreversible damage that could come if public consciousness fully turns against it. No amount of military strength can reverse the loss of moral capital once it begins to erode. In a world increasingly driven by perception and digital storytelling, the truth being seen and heard across borders is becoming a force in itself. Israel cannot bomb a hashtag, cannot detain a trending story, and cannot suppress the global conscience that is awakening to the Palestinian cause. This unraveling of control over the narrative is more dangerous to its long-term goals than any physical threat. The demographic time bomb is a growing source of anxiety within Israeli policy circles and strategic planning, yet it remains one of the least publicly acknowledged fears. At the heart of this fear lies the realization that the Jewish population within the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is slowly being outnumbered by the Arab population, particularly Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and even within Israel's borders. Despite all physical separation efforts, legal restrictions, and identity-based governance, the land is shared by two peoples whose population trends are moving in opposite directions. While Israel promotes immigration for Jews around the world to maintain a demographic advantage, Palestinian birth rates remain higher, and the youth population continues to grow at a pace that alarms Israeli demographers and strategists. This trend poses a significant threat to the Zionist ideal of a Jewish and democratic state. As the population balance tips, maintaining both a Jewish majority and democratic values becomes increasingly unsustainable. This demographic shift has driven many of Israel's most controversial policies, including settlement expansion, the legal and political separation of Palestinian territories, and laws that prioritize Jewish identity over democratic equality. The fear is not just statistical, it's existential. If Palestinians become the majority, and if they are ever granted equal rights within a one-state solution or force global actors to pressure Israel into such a framework, the political and cultural dominance of Jewish Israelis would be at risk. The current system depends on maintaining this imbalance through borders, checkpoints, ID systems, and differing sets of laws applied based on ethnicity and location. The fear of losing this control silently drives Israel's increasingly aggressive policies that aim to fragment Palestinian identity and diminish hopes of unification. What terrifies Israeli leadership most is the idea that despite walls, military campaigns, and decades of occupation, they cannot stop the numbers from changing, cannot erase the sheer presence of millions of Palestinians who live, breathe, dream, and demand rights on the very same land. Time is not on Israel's side in this regard. As generations pass, Palestinians grow not only in number but in consciousness and global recognition. This demographic reality turns every policy decision into a defensive maneuver against an unavoidable future. It is not a question of if this demographic shift will happen, but when and how the world will respond once it can no longer be hidden under the guise of security. The collapse of the Iron Dome of morality refers not to the failure of Israel's physical missile defense system, but to the breakdown of its ethical shield in the eyes of the global community. For years, Israel relied on a powerful narrative that it was a nation defending itself against relentless aggression, a democracy surrounded by threats, forced to act out of necessity. This story served as a moral dome, shielding it from international scrutiny and legal consequences, allowing it to conduct operations with impunity. However, that shield is weakening rapidly. The moral justification that once made world leaders hesitate before questioning Israeli policies is no longer holding. The world is watching. This time, not through the lens of government press releases, but through the screens of ordinary citizens capturing the reality on the ground in real time. The footage of bombed residential buildings, hospitals reduced to rubble, and civilians buried under debris is not just hard to ignore. It's impossible to morally defend. The concept of a self-defense is being reevaluated in light of disproportionate responses and decades-long occupation. The actions once viewed as strategic are increasingly being seen as punitive, and the silence that once followed military escalations is now being replaced by outrage. Prominent human rights organizations, both regional and global, have begun to classify Israeli policies and actions as apartheid and systemic oppression. This shift in language is not merely rhetorical. It represents a crumbling of the moral foundation upon which Israel stood for decades. Influential figures, journalists, and international legal bodies begin using such terminology. The shield of moral legitimacy fractures further. The growing resistance within Israel itself. Jewish voices speaking out against occupation, young soldiers refusing service, intellectuals challenging the status quo, also contributes to this collapse. It signals that even within the state, the moral cost is becoming unbearable for many. These voices are no longer isolated. They echo through global movements and are amplified by a public more connected and informed than ever before. The fear within Israel stems from the knowledge that no matter how advanced their weapons may be, they cannot destroy evidence of injustice, nor can they contain the global awakening to Palestinian suffering. Once the moral high ground is lost, every future act is judged through a different lens, and rebuilding that ethical credibility is far harder than defending a border. The collapse of this invisible shield represents a turning point Israel cannot easily recover from. Fear of internal fracture is one of Israel's most pressing and under-discussed anxieties. While the state constantly projects strength and unity to the outside world, internally it is grappling with a growing divide among its own citizens, ideologies, and identities. The fractures are not superficial or short-term. They run deep across religious, ethnic, political, and generational lines. Ultra-Orthodox Jews and secular Israelis often live in cultural and ideological opposition. Some call for a theocratic state guided by religious law, while others demand a liberal democracy that upholds civil rights for all. Settlers on the fringes of the West Bank push a hardline expansionist agenda, while urban Israelis in Tel Aviv express growing fatigue and moral discomfort with the occupation. These contradictions create a volatile environment where consensus is shrinking and polarization is deepening. The fear is that the glue holding the society together, Zionism as a unified cause, is losing its strength in the face of diverging visions for Israel's future. Within this internal fragmentation, ethnic divisions are equally dangerous. Palestinian citizens of Israel, who make up roughly 20% of the population, are increasingly vocal about discrimination, second-class status, and the contradiction of a state that claims to be both Jewish and democratic. Tensions rise not only during periods of war but also in times of so-called peace, where systemic inequality and daily microaggressions remind these citizens that their presence is tolerated but not fully accepted. This sense of exclusion builds resentment and opens the door to civil unrest that cannot be blamed on external enemies. Additionally, the growing Ethiopian Jewish community, Mizrahi Jews, and immigrants from the former Soviet Union each bring their own stories of marginalization within the Israeli system, contributing to a fractured sense of national identity. The Israeli youth, exposed to global conversations around human rights, justice, and decolonization, are beginning to question narratives they were once taught without doubt. Some refuse military service, others protest against the government's treatment of Palestinians, and many are growing disillusioned with the idea that militarism and nationalism are the only paths to safety. These internal awakenings worry the political and military elite who depend on a compliant and unified population to maintain control. As these divisions widen, the risk of internal collapse becomes more tangible than any external threat. The fear is not just of rockets from beyond the border, but of a society tearing itself apart from the inside, unable to reconcile its contradictions, and unable to silence the growing questions coming from its own children. What Israel fears most is not the weapon in an enemy's hand, but the truth rising in the hearts of the oppressed and the eyes of a world that no longer looks away. It fears the unbroken spirit of a people who refuse to vanish, the slow but certain collapse of a moral shield that can no longer cover injustice, and the irreversible turning of the tide in global conscience. From internal divisions to demographic realities, from the resistance on the ground to the voices rising across the globe, the truth is clear. This is a fear rooted not in weakness of defense, but in the fragility of denial. For decades, silence was their strongest ally. But now, silence is breaking. The fear is no longer a secret, it is here, and the world is watching. Thank you for listening with an open heart and an awakened mind. May this message stir your conscience, strengthen your resolve, and remind you that truth spoken boldly can shake the walls of power. Stay strong, stay aware, and never stop standing on the side of justice. Good luck on your journey toward truth. Peace be with you.